probably aware that the currency used in your country is created and tendered by your nation's government. But how much autonomy does the government have over the process of its creation? And if governments can print as much money as they like, why are there record levels of national debt? Perhaps most importantly, why are we, the citizens, liable for hefty taxes? To answer these questions accurately, let's take a deep dive into the system of money and the overall process of how money is created. Money creation is more or less the same throughout the entire world. Nonetheless, for the sake of this video, we're only going to focus on the United States. In practice, the government retains control while contracting the work of printing money out to the central bank and the Royal Mint. Paper currency and coins are the two most common types of physical currency. Although some economies still use it, physical currency's proportion is typically only between 3 and 8%. The banknotes are printed to fulfill private banking obligations, such as withdrawing money from an ATM. Now, coming back to the printing of notes, a $10 bill costs about 3 cents to print. This equates to a profit of about $9.97, which the government can include in tax receipts. Although this process may seem profitable, governments cannot just go overboard with it. Why? Well, if it were possible, there would be a huge potential for corruption. If the politicians could print money whenever they wanted to, there would be pressure to keep printing money to pay for things like wars and election promises. A massive devaluation of the currency is the theoretical result of this. Argentina, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela are some modern examples of this. Another important thing to note here is that money is actually a highly elastic asset, which shifts its value depending on what backs it. The value of money was typically expressed in terms of gold for many centuries. However, all this changed when President Richard Nixon made the announcement to end the fixed dollar-to-gold exchange rate in 1971.
Your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today. The effect of this action, in other words, will be to stabilize the dollar.
Now, the US dollar serves as a reserve currency for all other currencies. Remember the profits we discussed from printing money earlier? These earnings are referred to as signage, and the government and the citizenry alike benefit from it. It lessens the government's debt and the tax burden on individuals. However, inflationary pressures brought about by political decisions are why governments refrain from printing more of this currency. Now, let's discuss private banking and debt-based money. Modern money creation is dominated by the private banking sector. Nearly all currency in circulation today is created digitally by banks in the world's most developed economies. But this did not come easy. After only numerous failed attempts, were the banks eventually able to convince lawmakers to allow digital currency. When a large number of depositors try to withdraw their funds at once from a bank, this is known as a bank run, and the bank may not have enough funds to accommodate them. As a result of these occurrences, financial institutions argued for the right to create debt-based deposits in excess of what actually exists. As a result, digital currency was born. The practice of relying on debt as a means of exchange dates back much further in history. English legislators authorized the use of promissory notes in 1704. Whenever you borrow money, there is a legally binding contract to repay it. Earlier, a scrap of paper was used for this contract. These days, this kind of deal is typically recorded digitally. At this point, financial institutions are no longer restricted in their ability to issue new debt and, by extension, new money. Now, all this might sound a little confusing. So, let's see an example. When you borrow money from a bank, it can create new money with its double accounting. If you withdraw $100,000, the bank will deposit that amount into their account, and you will receive $100,000. That's the assurance that it will be repaid, plus interest. When you use that $100,000, the new owner can finance some of their expenses by taking on some of the bank's newly credited debt. This increases the amount of money in the system, and therefore, increasing debt is necessary for achieving higher rates of economic growth. The most important idea here is that debt is money. All you really need to understand is that when a bank lends you money, they aren't using someone else's savings. The sum of money you get was never part of the bank's reserves. They are essentially creating new money out of thin air. Just enter it into a computer and out pops government money in digital form, ready to be spent. Since the bank earns its profit by charging interest on newly created funds, it is the bank that ultimately benefits from this situation. Later, when you make this payment, despite the disappearance of both the debt and the funds, the interest earnings of the bank remain. Another way to generate virtual currency is through the real estate and property markets. Because the bank can foreclose on your home if you default on the loan, the mortgage market in developed countries backs enormous amounts of money. Banks are no longer investing in the general economy and are instead putting their money into real estate. As a result, home prices have increased as borrowers take on larger mortgages to purchase properties they might not have been able to afford otherwise. The real estate market has also experienced some pretty large bubble bursts, but all of us have still become addicted to taking on more and more debt. Now, where did the deposits go, one might ask? The moment you put money in a bank, the bank becomes the new owner. The way banks work is that they put aside 10% of your deposits as safety money, then lend out the remaining 90% to borrowers who, in turn, deposit the money into yet more banks. The next financial institution can then lend out 90% of the remaining 10%, and so on. So, what we call a deposit is really just the bank keeping track of its debt to the public. If they say they'll transfer it to your account, they're wrong. A bank owes you money, and what you think you're receiving is money is actually just a record of the money it owes you. The 10% safety deposit model worked only until March of 2020. Now, there is no longer any minimum required reserve amount. As a result of this measure, banks can now print an unlimited amount of money, and this trend is only expected to accelerate. With your money in escrow, banks and hedge funds can take risks by investing in things like derivatives and securities. Typically, these instruments are little more than wagers on whether or not the price of an asset will rise, but it can become ridiculous if carried too far. The collapse of the housing market and ultimately the global economy in 2008 can be traced back to these wacky categories of financial instruments. But the issue today is that banks are using so many derivatives, sometimes stacked on top of each other with leverage, multiplying factors, that no one knows how much money is at stake. The derivatives market is estimated to be 10 times the size of the global economy at over $1 quadrillion. During times of prosperity, people take out bank loans to buy things they would never be able to afford without the extra cash. However, inevitably, there will be economic consequences of this. Eventually, people reach a point where they simply can't afford to incur any more debt. Loans are no longer given, and the economy contracts as a result. It's inevitable and has been happening for centuries. But 2008 marked a turning point. Some analysts pinpointed this moment as the moment the real economy died because the world no longer wanted to endure the pain of a downturn. Due to their size, interconnectedness, and centrality to the money supply, governments were forced to use central banks to bail out failing banks. Keep in mind that 97% of all money is being created by banks as debt, and if that debt is not repaid, it poses a risk to the entire global monetary system. The economy was clinically dead in 2008, but has been kept alive ever since. Extremely low interest rates over the past decade have made borrowing money effectively free, leading to massive market distortions that have only made the situation worse. The benefits were temporary, but the drawbacks would last much longer. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell mentioned in an interview that central banks can bail out private banks that make risky bets and incur losses using their infinite wallet. So, in all likelihood, the central bank just flooded the system with cash. The central bank does have the power to produce as much as it wants, although in order to print money, it has to purchase treasury bills, bonds, or other government-guaranteed securities, which in turn expands the money supply. Nonetheless, this money is a debt and must be repaid. And guess who repays it? That's right, we do. Taxes from the populace are what keep governments afloat. Governments primarily collect revenue through taxation and trade. The interest on central bank loans is repaid with the funds raised here. Therefore, governments are left with debt when they use the central banks to bail out private banks for their risky behavior, and the taxpayers will have to pay it back in the future. Last but not least, we have central bank digital money. Also called QE or quantitative easing, the Bank of Japan came up with this concept. Through QE, a central bank creates new money to lend to the banking system, major corporations, and more recently, the general public. In extreme situations like the 2008 financial crisis, it can be used to inject large amounts of cash into the economy. The $700 billion bailout of QE in 2008, however, was very controversial. In his plan, the president proposed that the Treasury buy bad debts, totaling up to $700 billion, including many of the subprime mortgage deals, then put it on the American taxpayers' tab. And although the Federal Reserve anticipated this crisis to be temporary, it persisted throughout the following decade. Even now, the Federal Reserve of the United States has been creating hundreds of billions of dollars out of thin air. But the dollar is still the world's de facto reserve currency. Quantitative easing allows governments to repeatedly save themselves by printing money. But then why do we have to pay the amount back? Why cannot the government do it itself? The Federal Reserve's monetization of U.S. debt can make this possible, but at the expense of the middle class. The central banks purchase bonds from the government. The bond market is where these loans to businesses and governments take place. But contrary to popular belief, when you compare the bond market with the stock market, the latter is larger. Without savings, central banks can simply print the money to purchase such bonds on the open market. This makes the central bank immortal. Don't believe me? Well, according to a paper released by the European Central Bank in 2016, central banks are safe from bankruptcy because of their unique ability to print money. Despite this, governments all over the world are currently in a very difficult position. They have no choice but to raise taxes in order to fund operations. And while it's hoped that the borrowed funds will help revitalize the economy, something else seems to be taking place. When government or corporate bonds are purchased by central banks, it is possible for them to amass vast wealth. Let me give you one of the many examples of this. The Japanese central bank's balance sheet is greater than the country's entire GDP. The largest investor in the Japanese stock market is the Bank of Japan. Central banks are not only producing new money, but are also unable to go bankrupt. With their powers, they are purchasing physical assets. It turns out there are repercussions to the practice of printing money out of thin air and spending it on material possessions. The central bank's intervention in the economy is largely to blame for the millions of Americans who are unemployed. With interest rates hovering around 0%, the central bank printed trillions and distributed them to banks and hedge funds. The real economy, however, received hardly any of this funding because it went straight into the stock market. Housing and stock market inflation have been observed worldwide. The newly created currency is invested in these assets, driving up their prices and enriching the already wealthy few who hold significant stock holdings. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer as the real economy stagnates. Many people are aware of the wealth gap but are unable to pinpoint its source. When governments print money, those who get it first get to enjoy higher living standards at the expense of those who get it later. This is because when the people at the bottom get their money, inflation has already taken its toll. The term CANON effect describes this phenomenon, and the money velocity increases once the wealthy begin selling off their stocks and real estate to invest in other areas. So, the world's central banks do not have any savings and are immune to bankruptcy. Yet, the debts due to the purchase of bonds by the central bank will be incurred by future generations of a country's residents and must be repaid either through taxation or inflation. What shall we do then? It's obvious that people who have lost their jobs need assistance, but in my humble opinion, printing more money is just a band-aid. Past problems have already been solved. Decades ago, instead of overspending on housing, financialization, and gambling, nations should have prioritized creating wealth. That is, financial institutions should have extended credit to sectors that contribute to society's well-being and growth, such as small and medium-sized enterprises, entrepreneurs, educational institutions, and manufacturing firms. Imagine the banks take on more risk, but the gains, in the long run, bring about increased productivity, new products and services, healthier competition, and higher wages for everyone. Tax revenue from these sources would have helped governments increase their coffers without having to increase rates. When people have higher incomes, more of their tax dollars go toward helping those who really need it. Money can be created through the printing press, but wealth cannot. Wealth creation and productivity are important, but they require time, effort, and hard work to achieve. But it's too late to try this now, unfortunately. All of our economies could have been much more resilient if we had prioritized investing in wealth creation before COVID struck. So, what do you think is going to happen? In the time to come, we'll be dealing with major, unpleasant developments. We might be hit by stagflation, characterized by low economic growth and high inflation. Similar events occurred in the 1970s, but the current situation may be even more dire due to the compounding effects of massive levels of debt and social unrest. The conventional wisdom holds that confidence in the US dollar will decline worldwide in the long run. Some macroeconomists, however, believe that the US dollar will rise in value as other countries try to sell their goods or exchange falling currencies for the US dollar, which is the cleanest economy in a world of falling economies. A lot of people think that digital currency will be the key to unlocking a lot of doors. Then, there are also those who believe that countries can print an unlimited amount of money, so long as they maintain a high enough rate of economic growth to service the interest on their national debt. This case is based on the claim that debt repayment is unnecessary. The term modern monetary theory helps to describe this concept. Independent currencies have been issued by small communities in Venezuela and a small town in Italy, but in the end, we do not know whether it will actually work. Gold's potential is being recognized, and the term money of last resort has been applied to it. Over the past few years, gold purchases have been made by other central banks at record levels as well, including China and Russia. They probably realize what's coming. Many younger people are drawn to cryptocurrencies because governments and the banking system are finally taking the technology seriously. Now, you can play the central bank's game in reverse if you're feeling particularly bold. Learn about these factors and put your money into the assets you believe will appreciate because of them. But always do your own independent thinking and study to determine what you think is best. The creation of money and the banking system as a whole seems like acts of madness, and people are beginning to realize that the system is broken. Because of its pervasiveness and depth of penetration, the monetary system is largely hidden from view. Even as things started to go wrong, no one ever raised any doubts. They highlighted the obvious, highlighting what appeared to be problems or issues on the surface level. But you have to look beneath the surface before you can fully understand what is really happening around us. What do you think? Should money creation be such an unsupervised process, or should other unbiased groups outside of nations' governments have some oversight in the process? What ideas do you have to help improve a system that is clearly failing in the long term? Please let us know in the comments. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more content just like this. Until next time.